good day to the listening and viewing public. My name is Stacey Carmichael. Welcome to the Progress Report. Now, today we are joined by Senior Minister within the Office of the President with responsibility for finance, the Honorable Dr. Ashni Singh. Minister Singh, it's a pleasure having you on Progress Report.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on the program. It's my pleasure.
You're welcome. And how are you today?
Very good, thank you.
Okay, now let's get right into it. We have a number of questions to ask you today. My first question to you is, what was the state of affairs when this government took office?
Very good, Stacey. So, first of all, once again, let me say what a great pleasure it is to be on this program. It's in fact my first real substantive engagement with the DPI and with yourself. It's a great pleasure to be here, and once again to see so many old friends with whom I worked in the past. You ask about the state of affairs when our government took office. Quite a lot has been said about various aspects of the state of the country at the time that our government assumed office. I'm not going to repeat or rehash what has been said already, but instead I will focus on a few particular aspects, particularly as it relates to the economy, and aspects that may have been mentioned but haven't really been fully ventilated as yet. If I might perhaps start with a snapshot of how I see things, I would say that the economy went through an extremely challenging period over the last 5 years. And this has manifested itself in a number of areas. It's manifested itself in very modest, sluggish growth at a time when, in fact, given the imminent production of oil, we should have seen much more rapid growth given all of the investments that have been coming on stream in preparation for oil production, and now that oil production has started. When you consider that reality, when you consider that Guyana over the last 5 years was a country on the verge of becoming an oil-producing nation and then became an oil-producing nation, the kind of growth that we should have seen in Guyana with the development of all of the ancillary services that typically come with oil and gas production, etc., did not manifest themselves. And so, in fact, what we saw was extremely sluggish growth considering the context in which Guyana was in. Part of this, of course, was, or a large part of this, in fact, was due to the political environment. And so, as you know, for the last 2 years, the country has effectively been in a situation where a no-confidence motion had been passed in December 2018, but was not being respected with the constitutionally stipulated election that should have come within 3 months of the no-confidence motion. And that effectively created a political environment that was not only not conducive, but severely harmful to the economic environment. So people essentially, the investor community became extremely worried about investing in Guyana. So investor and business confidence plummeted to an all-time low. And with the result that there was very limited economic activity, consumer confidence dried up, people were very worried, they were very cautious. They were very and understandably and correctly concerned about the political environment and in the direction in which the country was going to go. That, in fact, became even worse during the period from March to August, when the political environment deteriorated even more dramatically. So you had now not only the ignoring of a no-confidence motion, which was subsequently, the no-confidence motion having been subsequently upheld by the Caribbean Court of Justice and still not implemented in a timely election. You then had, during March to August, a further deterioration in the political environment, which in fact further harmed the economy. And effectively, the economy was at a complete standstill. Now, with that in mind, so I would say on the productive side, I would say that real growth was much, much lower than it should have been in the economy. In addition to that, you had what I would call extremely worrying developments as it relates to the management of the public finances. And so if you look at the state of the public finances, I would say that it would not be an exaggeration to say that the public finances the state of the public finances that we found when we came into office was nothing short of disastrous. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how this manifested itself, just to illustrate what I mean when I say that we inherited a disastrous, a state that can only be characterized as disastrous. To illustrate this point, I would say if you look, for example, at the financial operations of the central government, so this is government revenue, government expenditure, the central government deficit, and how that deficit is financed, we saw an extremely alarming development over the last 5 years. So let's take, for example, the government revenue. The previous government collected almost $1 trillion, 992 billion Guyana dollars in government revenue over the period from 2015 to 2019. So there are a number of issues that come up from that, including the impact that the excessive taxation of the real economy had, and the excessive taxation of households and the income that had on disposable incomes, on financing available in the private sector for investment, etc. So first of all, it needs to be understood that over the 5-year period from 2015 to 2019, that government, our predecessors in office, collected 992 billion Guyana dollars in revenue, took $992 billion in revenue out of the economy. Of course, governments all around the world collect revenue, collect taxes to finance the services of government. Having collected $992 billion of revenue over the last 5 years, total expenditure over the 5-year period amounted to 1.2 trillion Guyana dollars, 1.172 billion to be precise. Let's say 1.2 trillion Guyana dollars. Now you can have an entire conversation about what that $1.2 trillion was spent on. There's a whole conversation. That's probably the subject of another program. What I will say is that a lot of the growth in public expenditure over the last 5 years was extremely unproductive and extremely wasteful. So you saw a rapid escalation in government consumption. This is government current expenditure. So this is not expenditure in physical assets or in expanding the infrastructure of the country, but largely a ramping up of government consumption. So tremendous growth in the government wage bill, and a lot has been said already about the growth in public sector employment, but also tremendous growth in government consumption of things like other goods and services, whether it is traveling, whether it is meals, whether it is, all of those recurrent operating expenses. And there's a a lot of this is completely unproductive and completely wasteful expenditure. There's a lot of, people joke a lot about, people speak almost facetiously, about painting things green and so on. Those things are not free, every time you repaint a fence, and people don't paint government fences or government buildings for free. People don't reprint government letterheads and rechange government logos because we sort of frivolously want to change the outward facade. Those things don't happen for free. They came with a cost, and so there was a lot of very, very wasteful and inefficient expenditure. That's a whole different conversation. But the result of government expenditure exceeding government revenue by the level that it did was the incurrence of significant fiscal deficits over the 5-year period. In fact, the accumulated fiscal deficits over the 5-year period amounts to 130 billion Guyana dollars. So in fact, if you look at the period from 2015, and it's important that your viewers understand what this means. If you look at the period from 2015 to 2019, so that's the 5-year period, five-year period during which the APNU-AFC coalition was in office, the aggregate deficit, the amount by which government expenditure exceeded government revenues and grants, the aggregate of the fiscal deficit, the amount by which expenditure exceeded inflows or government outflows exceeded government inflows was 130 billion Guyana dollars. So consider that for a moment. It's a very substantial sum of money, and obviously the incurrence of a deficit has to be financed somehow. Here again, of course, it's not unusual. Governments from time to time incur deficits. I mean, we in our previous time in office also incurred a deficit, but one incurs a deficit in a sort of, you have to ensure that the deficit that you incur is consistent with the sort of, you know, in the medium and longer term consistent with fiscal and debt sustainability, and you have to be very careful about the level of the deficit and how it's going to be financed. If you dive into how the deficit was financed, you get an even more alarming story revealing itself, and there's a particular issue that I want to highlight. So when your expenditure exceeds your revenue, some of it is financed by external loans. So of course external loans were taken. Some of it is financed by the utilization of government deposits. So government might have an accumulation of deposits in the central bank, or it's financed by domestic borrowing. There are a couple of developments that I want to highlight in relation to the financing of the deficit over the last 5 years. The first is quite a lot of external debt was contracted. In fact, when you look at the debt numbers, you might be tempted to say that external debt didn't increase that much over the last 5 years. But if you look at the amount of debt that was contracted, quite a lot of external debt was contracted but did not get disbursed because of inefficiencies in implementing projects. So the total new external debt that was contracted over the last 5 years amounted to almost $400 million US. So that's $500 million US. It's over $400 million US was contracted over the last 5 years. And then on the domestic side, and this is the particular point that I want to make, on the domestic side, not only were public deposits run down and exhausted, but the government in fact accumulated a large overdraft at the central bank. And to be specific, when we demitted office, the government was in fact a net depositor in the central bank, meaning that the government had $16 billion in the central bank when we demitted office in May 2015, at the end of April 2015. So at the end of April 2015, the government was a net depositor in the central bank. We had net deposits of $16 billion in the central bank. In July 2020, the government net position at the central bank was an overdraft of $93 billion. So over the space of the last 5 years, the government moved from being a net depositor in the amount of $16 billion to being a net borrower from the central bank in an amount totaling $93 billion. So that's you can see the turnaround. The deterioration, the accumulated deterioration was in fact more than $100 billion. And there are a couple of points that I want to make here. Here again, if you just look at the aggregate debt numbers, you might say, well, total domestic debt did not increase that much. But the domestic debt numbers that are reported don't actually include the overdraft that was incurred at the central bank. And if you add the overdraft that was incurred at the central bank, which really should have been financed by way of either government borrowing in issuance of government treasury bills or other means, if you add that amount, the amount of the overdraft that was incurred, to the domestic debt, you in fact find that government, and this is something that I have my staff looking at very closely, and I've asked them to look at the numbers very closely. You, in fact, see a picture that suggests that the government effectively, and I use that word cautiously, that the government effectively would have breached there's a ceiling on how much domestic debt can be borrowed. If that overdraft had been securitized by the issuance of treasury bills or other government instruments, then effectively the government ceiling on domestic debt would have been breached, because in law there is a ceiling on how much domestic debt the government can contract. That ceiling is $150 billion. If you add the existing level of domestic debt, you add on top of that the overdraft that was incurred. So the existing stock of domestic debt is about $80 billion. If you add on top of that the $90 billion overdraft that was incurred at the central bank, you will end up in excess of this legally stipulated ceiling on government borrowing. Now, of course, the government did not issue securities or treasury bills or anything to cover that borrowing, and just basically accumulated a big overdraft and has now left an overdraft of $93 billion in the central bank to be resolved. So that's the situation. We've inherited a situation where the government has a net overdraft at the central bank of $93 billion. I highlight that really to make the point, and like I said, I've asked my staff to look more closely at these numbers to confirm, because if that is the case, it has very serious implications if it is the case that effectively the domestic debt ceiling has been breached. Or effectively, I use the word effectively because, like I said, instruments were not actually issued. What happened is, an overdraft was just accumulated. There are other layers to this. So, for example, you would have known there's been a lot of media reporting about a bond being issued by NISIL. That was a bond, I think the amount was $30 billion. I think out of that $30 billion, $17 billion would have been drawn down. This is a NISIL bond that was issued for the purposes of providing support to Gaisuco. And the government issued a guarantee for that bond. And so that also has to be taken into consideration, because that has an implication also, ultimately, given that the government has issued a guarantee to secure that borrowing by another state entity. That also has to be taken into consideration. So when you add all of these levels, all of these layers, you have the debt that is reported. This is the external and domestic debt that is reported, plus the contracted external debt that has been contracted but not yet disbursed, plus the overdraft that has been incurred at the central bank, plus the other public sector debts that have been guaranteed by government. You see a picture that is extremely alarming, to put it mildly. Then there are a number of other dimensions that I could elaborate on. So, for example, government owes a lot of money to suppliers of goods and services, and there's one in particular that I will highlight. GPL is, of course, the national power utility. It supplies electricity to everybody, including government and government installations. Government owes a staggering amount of money, a staggering amount of money. Here again, I've asked my staff to do some work on this number, but government owes GPL in excess. Right now, according to the numbers that I have seen, and it could rise, government owes GPL in excess. This is various government entities owes GPL in excess of $12 billion, which is a staggering amount. You can imagine what that means for the finances of the power utility. And there's a lot of sort of similar things like this. I mean, it's, you have GWI. I mean, one of the entities owing GPL money is GWI. GWI owes GPL, I think, in excess of $7 billion in unpaid electricity bills. And so taken together, all these bits and pieces point to what can only be described as gross mismanagement of the public finances. Under no circumstances should this overdraft have been accumulated at the central bank and left unattended. And I might add that this is a matter that was highlighted by the International Monetary Fund. As you know, the International Monetary Fund does annual reviews of our economy, as they do with every other economy around the world. And on more than one occasion, in fact, on at least 2 occasions that I've seen, the IMF drew attention to the overdraft that was accumulating at the central bank, flagged it as an issue of concern, and called on the government to take corrective action to resolve this matter. That action was not taken for whatever reason. I'm not sure what reason, but that action has not been taken. And so this matter is now still unresolved and is to be resolved. There are lots of other things that I could highlight that I think need resolution. I mean, I think one other example, so I mean, I would say if I were to flag two things, I would say one, this situation about the accumulation of this overdraft at the central bank. And the second issue that I would flag is the utilization of the contingencies fund. I mean, here again, the law provides for a contingencies fund, and successive governments have used the contingencies fund as the law intends. But much to our astonishment, we discovered that during the latter part of 2019, so bear in mind, if you consider the timeline, if you consider that in December 2018 the no confidence motion was passed, and you consider that in June or July the CCJ issued its final ruling with respect to the no confidence motion, by which time it was beyond discussion and dispute that the government was in a complete caretaker mode. Astonishingly, after that CCJ ruling came out in June or July, between the period from July and December 2019, no less than $4.2 billion, about 4.15 billion Guyana dollars, was drawn from the contingencies fund to meet a variety of expenditure that had not been budgeted for. And considering that the government was clearly in caretaker mode, considering that an election was impending, and that I believe even President Granger had acknowledged himself that his government was in caretaker mode, I think I would say that it's unusual that the government would have resorted to drawing down $4.2 billion from the contingencies fund at that time. Ironically, the government had boasted the previous year that they had not used the contingencies fund, I think in 2017 or 18 or so, and they spoke about the fact that they hadn't used the contingencies fund, and they spoke very proudly of the fact that they had not used the contingencies fund in 2017 and 18. It appeared to have been a matter of great pride to them that they hadn't used the contingencies fund, but yet in 2019, when they were clearly in caretaker mode, they would then turn to the contingencies fund and draw down, like I said, no less than $4.2 billion on all sorts of miscellaneous expenditure, which, like I said, is unusual.
Thank you very, very much, Minister. Now, you said a lot about the state of affairs in terms of the country's finances. What is the government's plan moving forward to resolve these issues and to also attract investment?
Sure. So, while one might be forgiven for arriving at the conclusion that the picture is a very gloomy one, and frankly, it is in many respects a very gloomy picture that we have inherited. In some sense, I feel almost like we are in déjà vu, or I feel a sense of déjà vu, because those who are old enough would recall that in 1992 we also inherited a situation where the economy was in disarray, with unsustainable levels of debt, which then had to be restructured, and the public finances had to literally be rebuilt from scratch. I believe that it is beyond dispute that the People's Progressive Party Civic has a well-established track record for responsible economic management, and for economic management that is conducive to creating an environment that is attractive to investment. And one simply has to look at what was achieved during the period from 1992 to 2015, when the country was brought back from the brink of bankruptcy to a state where we were clearly on a path to prosperity. Then, of course, 2015 to 20 happened. I would say that notwithstanding the gloomy picture that has been inherited, we have set about in earnest immediately to turn the situation around on a number of fronts. First of all, a non-negotiable prerequisite for an attractive investment environment is democracy and respect for the rule of law. That's a non-negotiable prerequisite. No international investor will come to a country that does not respect democracy and does not abide by the principles, the universally accepted principles of democracy. The world watched on with disbelief at the events of March to August. And the world expressed collectively a sigh of relief when, on the 2nd of August, President Irfan Ali was finally sworn in as president. An event that really should have happened 2 or 3 days after the 2nd of March. But having waited, like I said, I believe the world collectively exhaled a sigh of relief. The restoration of democracy in Guyana, I think, is the first and probably singularly most important prerequisite for Guyana once again being the attractive environment for investment that it was, the attractive destination for investment that it was prior to 2015. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you would have seen in the emergency budget that our government tabled in Parliament, we moved swiftly to reverse many of the punitive measures that had been implemented during the period 2015 to 2020, which had weighed heavily on the shoulders of the Guyanese people. Do not underestimate how important it is to ensure that families have disposable incomes, that they can take to the market and consume goods and services, that they can save and invest, whether it is in a home or a mode of transportation or some physical assets in their home, or that they can accumulate as financial savings in the bank for a rainy day. Do not underestimate how important these issues are. And the removal of all manner of benefits that we had put in place, whether it is the grant to school children, whether it is the subsidy for pensioners, for water and electricity. I mean, there's a long list, and I don't want to rehash that list because a lot has been said about this already. But we moved very swiftly. You would have seen that within the space of just a few weeks, the emergency budget immediately reversed so many of these punitive measures that really had imposed a lot of hardship on the Guyanese people. But in fact, these punitive measures had also been a significant contributor to the sluggish growth that we observed during the period. Because if people don't have, if you take away disposable income from people, if you tax the economy, if you overtax the private sector and the household sector, and you take away every single avenue of support that they had previously been provided with, you introduce VAT on their electricity and VAT on their water and so on and so forth, then inevitably household consumption is going to dry up. That's going to have an impact on things like retail. It's going to have an impact on things like construction. I mean, you know, you can see it. I mean, there are entire housing developments that emerged literally from abandoned cane fields and have now became thriving communities during the 92 to 2015 period. You know, there are many. You look at whether it's Diamond Grove, Parfait Harmony, or wherever. There are many, many throughout the length and breadth of the coast of this country where entire communities were developed as a result, not just of government putting infrastructure in, but of individual households going to the bank, taking a mortgage, supported, of course, by the measures that we put in place to make lending for home ownership more affordable, investing and saving and building their home and improving their home and expanding their homes. And thousands, tens of thousands of Guyanese families did that. Every Guyanese family that builds a home, or every home that's under construction, results in, dozens of jobs, whether it's carpenters, masons, painters, plumbers, the people who drive the transportation to bring the sand from the sand pit or to bring the cement from the hardware store, the jobs that are created and the incomes that are generated in the hardware store. And so we did that not by accident or not frivolously. All of these initiatives to promote home ownership, to ensure that people have disposable income, etc., they were done by design to ensure that we had a vibrant and dynamic economy, and all of those things were taken away during 2015 to 2020. So it's no surprise that the economy was sluggish. It's no surprise that economic activity dried up. I mean, one can scarcely find a single major development that you can point to that emerged during the last 5 years. I mean, the truth is that what you see really is just a continuation of some of the projects that we had in place, and very little is there in terms of, new housing development, new infrastructure, etc. Very, very little.
Thank you very much, Minister Singh. Moving on to the next question, Budget 2020 or emergency budget. How far along are we with implementation, and what can we expect going forward with the 2021 budget? If you can give us a little bit of highlight.
So Budget 2020 included a number of initiatives, like I said, and a number of projects, a number of policies that we announced, initiatives, etc. And we've been moving apace to ensure that those are implemented. Where it's a policy, to ensure that the policy has been implemented, whether by way of whatever action is required to give effect to the policy. And for the the various projects and the various initiatives that are intended that were included in the budget, we've been working very hard. I've been meeting with my staff, and I've been meeting in many cases with many of the large ministries and the various sectors to ensure that they proceed with implementation as fast as possible. Quite a lot of progress has been made in implementing. Most of the main policy measures have been implemented. You've seen, like the VAT on electricity and water and so on. Those things have already been implemented. What remains to be done now is mainly execution of the various projects that are in the budget. And I've been at pains to emphasize to my colleagues in the cabinet that it's very important that we proceed with execution. The President has given all of us a mandate and has been very clear that he would like all of the projects in the budget to be executed in a timely manner. And so with the mandate that has been given to me and to the rest of my colleagues in the cabinet, I've been working, like I said, with the various sectors to ensure that they proceed with execution as quick as possible, as rapidly as possible, in the most timely manner, bearing in mind, of course, considerations of efficiency and so on. But in addition to that, you ask about Budget 2021. Yes. Budget 2021 is going to be an extremely important budget. As you know, like we said, 2020 was really an emergency budget. It was something that we had to get in place very quickly because the country had been without a budget for 9 months. Yes. Budget 2021 is going to be the first full year budget that the country would have had, for a couple of years. And it's going to, importantly, it's going to be the first budget of this government's current term of office. So it's going to outline our medium and long-term vision. It's going to include a number of the important initiatives that we see as critical to realizing the modern Guyana that will be unfolding over the course of the next few years. And so it's going to be a very significant and important budget in the sort of medium-term perspective. Preliminary work has already started on it. In fact, later today, my ministry will be issuing the budget circular, which essentially is the instruction to the various ministries to start preparing their budgets and submit them to us. That will be going out later today. And of course, ministries have already been doing preliminary work and considering their strategic priorities and so on. But the formal budget circular will actually be going out later today. And immediately after it goes out, work across government will immediately be stepped up to accelerate preparation of the budgets. And our aim, obviously, given the substantial nature of Budget 2021, it's going to involve quite a lot of work. But here again, the President is very clear that he expects the various ministries to do all that is necessary to ensure that they prepare their budgets in a timely manner so that we can have a budget in place early next year and we can proceed with implementation. So that work is really going to start in earnest from next week, once the budget circular goes out today.
Okay. Thank you very much, Minister. In terms of interest, we've noticed that some major hotels have expressed interest in building here in Guyana. What does that signal for our economy going forward and with the oil and gas sector coming on stream?
Sure. So I'm glad that you asked that question, because one of the criticisms of the last government was that you heard quite a lot about oil and gas and so on, but people said almost facetiously, this is the man in the street joking, people talking casually, that almost, their strategy was just to wait for the oil money to come, because there was very little else happening. You saw very little else happening. You saw much of the other productive sectors essentially being destroyed. You saw sugar, for example, being completely destroyed, and others. In distinct contrast to our predecessors in office, we believe very firmly that we must have a vibrant, dynamic, and rapidly growing non-oil economy, and we feel that very strongly. We don't want to fall into the trap of being a country that is solely dependent on the oil and gas sector. Now, of course, oil and gas will be extremely important, and one would be foolish to say otherwise, but the non-oil economy will be extremely important. And by the non-oil economy, what do I mean? Apart from oil and gas, obviously you're going to need onshore support services, and some of this is quite obvious, logistics, etc. But we want also to ensure that, and this is linked to the debate on the local content as well, we want also to ensure that our domestic private sector is able to supply goods and services to meet the requirements of this rapidly expanding economy, not just the oil companies, in the context of a low-content policy. So whether it is, let's take agriculture and food production. Guyana has always had phenomenal potential for agriculture and food production. For a long time, we've been hearing about Guyana having the potential to be the food basket of the Caribbean, et cetera, et cetera. And up to 2015, we had done a lot of work to create an environment where large-scale agriculture could become a reality. And there were a number of projects that were on the verge of being realized in relation to large-scale agriculture. Over the last 5 years, agriculture was kind of treated as a sort of distant cousin of lesser importance. We intend to place agriculture back on the center stage, and we believe that food production, agriculture and food production will have an extremely important part to play in the Guyanese economy going forward. But there are other sectors as well. So, for example, given the heightened interest in Guyana, given the level of international traffic coming into Guyana, given Guyana's, so not just oil and gas, given Guyana's remarkable potential for ecotourism, Guyana's remarkable natural beauty, the tourism and hospitality sector has an extremely, is uniquely poised to grow in terms of new hotels, new restaurants, and new new ancillary services to the tourism sector and so on, new tour operators and so on. So you mentioned hotels. You would have seen how many expressions of interest have been received already from the private sector to develop new hotels. And of course, this is important because not only is it going to change the physical landscape of the country, not only is it going to, improve our hotel room capacity, but these things create jobs as well. And it's Guyanese who are going to be working either with these hotel companies. It's Guyanese who are going to be owning and working in the running the tour companies and running the transport companies and the taxis. It's going to be Guyanese companies and Guyanese individuals owning the farms and owning the food production and food processing facilities and so on. So these things create jobs and they create prosperity for our people across the country. And so you're going to see quite a lot of this happening. You've seen the spurt of interest in the hotels, but you're going to see a lot more of this happening in the not only in the tourism and hospitality sector, but across the entire spectrum of productive activity. And our commitment as a government is to create not just the policy environment that is conducive, but also the supportive infrastructure, so things like roads and bridges and so on. In fact, later today, you might already know this, some of your viewers might know this, later today we will be opening the expressions of, we will be receiving and opening the expressions of interest for the new Demerara River Bridge, which of course is going to make a dramatic change. Once that bridge is complete, it's going to make a dramatic change to the transport infrastructure of our country in terms of connectivity between West Demerara and the east bank of the Demerara. And that's only one project. The President has spoken also about his vision for infrastructure, connectivity with Brazil, connectivity with Suriname, and what that will mean in terms of regional hemispheric integration, but also catalyzing economic activity. If Brazilian companies can literally drive to the Guyana coast and use the deep water harbor in Guyana, if Surinamese companies can do likewise, it potentially dramatically increases the economic space and the market opportunities for domestic companies. So it's really, notwithstanding the gloomy picture that we've inherited, I would say that there's a lot of good reason and good basis for optimism going forward.
Thank you again, Minister Singh. In terms of economic growth, what is the anticipated or expected projection come 2021? Sure.
Now, this is a major headline that's going to be announced in the 2021 budget. I would not want to preempt it for a variety of reasons, one of which is I wouldn't want to preempt what we're going to be saying in Budget 2021, but also because we're currently doing some of that work. We're currently looking at what the prospects are for the economy, assessing them, and trying to sort of fine-tune our estimates fine-tune our estimates of growth for 2021 and into the medium term. So I wouldn't want to be either preemptive or cavalier in just giving you a number that hasn't benefited from the thorough analysis that is required to understand what's going to happen in the economy next year.
Okay, thank you so much, Minister. And my other question would be in relation to the COVID-19 cash grant. Now, a lot of people would like to know, how does that assist, how would that help the economy as well?
Well, I would say that there are two aspects to this. First of all, people were facing very severe hardship in Guyana until recently for a variety of reasons. One, the economy was doing so badly that there were no jobs, and we spoke about that already. So a lot of people were not working to begin with because of the political environment. And on top of that, COVID came and imposed additional strain on the economy and additional pressure on households. So, as you know, for a long period during the onset of COVID, the economy was, even further affected because even basic services had literally ground to a halt. People were not going out. The lockdown was in place, etc., etc. And you know, Stacey, I will tell you this, people were really facing a lot of hardship, a lot of hardship. And as a government, we have always been deeply concerned, particularly as it relates to the most vulnerable in our society. And you see this in all of our policies. Recognizing the hardships that people were facing, we introduced this COVID cash grant to bring immediate relief to households. And so the first point that I want to make is that it brings relief to households, and it makes a difference to people that they receive this grant. And you've seen many people saying that publicly, that they are, that the grant, has provided valuable help to them. But importantly, when they receive this grant, they then use that grant to buy goods and services. They are then able to go to the market and they buy some groceries, whether it's a little bit of fruits and vegetables, some rice, some flour, some meat. They're able to go to the market and they spend that money in the market. So it generates a little bit of economic activity in the market. The market vendor then in turn is able to pay their supplier. And that multiplies itself over and over many times in the economy. And so an injection of this nature has tremendous multiplier effects in the economy, positive multiplier effects in the economy, because it generates the consumption that it stimulates at the household level, then feeds into the retail trade, and that then feeds into the wholesale trade, and that then feeds into the into production. And so, and we've seen this happen. Having disbursed the grants, people are going to the markets, they're spending this money, things are looking a little bit brighter. And you can already see in the period, I would say from the period of 2nd of August to now, and then even more so from the period of the passage of the emergency budget to now, you can already see that economic activity is resuming. You can literally see it. You can see, and I mean, of course, we have been very cautious. We still have a lot of COVID protocols in place. I wouldn't say that, there's a return to normalcy by any stretch of the imagination. COVID is still very much with us and has to be taken very seriously. But you're seeing that economic activity is being stimulated. People are going back to the markets. There's a little bit of economic activity starting again. And initiatives such as the COVID grant help to stimulate economic activity in very substantial measure. So I guess in summary, I would say it's a tremendous help at the individual household level, but it's also a tremendous source of economic activity at the macroeconomic level.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. Now we're wrapping up the program. Any final remarks as it relates to the economy, economic growth, and the future of the financial sector in Guyana?
Sure. So, like I said, I mean, notwithstanding the very gloomy picture that we've inherited, the sad state of affairs that we've inherited, notwithstanding that a lot of the productive sector and the business sector really struggled over the last 5 years. Like I said earlier, I think there's a lot of good and sound basis for optimism. President Ali has outlined a very exciting vision for Guyana. And he has charged me and he has charged the rest of his cabinet to ensure that that vision is realized. And we have gone about it with a sense of great urgency, as you can see. And I would say to you that with a fair degree of certainty, I can say to you that the Guyana of tomorrow will be, by tomorrow I mean perhaps the Guyana of 5 years or 10 years down the road, will be virtually unrecognizable compared to the Guyana of today in a positive, in a remarkably positive way. It's going to be a different Guyana. Our government is committed to continuing to implement the right policies, a sound and responsible policy framework. We're committed to continuing to attract large foreign investors, and you've seen many of them coming, but we're also committed to ensuring that the domestic private sector expands and grows and improves its competitiveness and improves its ability to operate in this new economic landscape, this new and incredibly exciting economic landscape. But most importantly, as a government, we are committed to ensuring that the lives of every single Guyanese person, the lives of every single Guyanese family, that those lives are improved in a tangible and demonstrable way. That is our commitment to the people of Guyana. And so I think that I think it's an incredibly exciting time we are living in incredibly exciting times for our country, and I think the future is really remarkably bright, and I think we are on the verge of realizing the long heralded potential of this beautiful country of ours.
Well, thank you so much, Minister Singh, for joining us on the Progress Report. You have said a lot, and of course we want to do a part 2. So I'm extending that invitation to you before we wrap up the program for part 2, where we continue to talk about the developments in the financial sector and the economy as a whole.
Sure. Thank you very much, Stacey. Like I said, it's been my great pleasure, and I'd be happy to come back and do it again at any time.
Sure. And I want to thank all the listening and viewing public. This has been Progress Report. I'm Stacey Carmichael saying goodbye for now.